by any means necessary. For words that would define a generation's struggle for justice. For words spoken by a man who transformed himself from street hustler to one of the most influential voices in American history. But who was Malcolm X before he became an icon? What shaped the man behind the rhetoric? And what can his life, particularly his relationships, his marriage, and his evolution, teach us about transformation, love, and the courage to change? This is the story of Malcolm Little, who became Detroit Red, who became Malcolm X, who finally became El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz. This is the story of a man who learned that the greatest revolution begins not in the streets, but within oneself. Malcolm Little was born on May 19, 1925, in Omaha, Nebraska, into a world that was hostile to his very existence. His father, Earl Little, was a Baptist preacher and an outspoken supporter of Marcus Garvey's Back to Africa movement. His mother, Louise Helen Little, was a strong, educated woman from Grenada who could pass for white but chose to identify as black, a decision that would cost her dearly. Malcolm would later say that his first memory was of his home burning down when he was 4 years old. White supremacists had set it ablaze because Earl Little refused to stop preaching about black pride and black autonomy. The family escaped, but the message was clear: speaking truth to power came with consequences. The Little family moved to Lansing, Michigan, searching for safety they would never truly find. Malcolm grew up watching his father preach black nationalism, while his mother struggled to feed 8 children. He witnessed the complexity of his parents' relationship, Earl's fierce pride and occasional violence, Louise's strength and silent suffering, the love that existed alongside hardship. In 1931, when Malcolm was 6 years old, his father was found dead on the trolley tracks, his body nearly severed in half. The official ruling was suicide. The family knew it was murder. The Black Legion, a white supremacist group, had made good on their threats. But proving it was impossible in a system designed to protect white violence and dismiss black testimony. Earl Little's death was not just the loss of a father. It was the beginning of a systematic destruction of a family. The insurance company refused to pay the life insurance policy, claiming suicide. Louise Little was left alone with 8 children, no income, and a society determined to break her. Malcolm watched his mother slowly unravel under the weight of poverty, racism, and grief. She tried to hold the family together, working odd jobs, stretching pennies into meals, maintaining dignity when the world offered nothing but degradation. Malcolm would later describe this period with painful clarity, watching his proud, intelligent mother forced to accept welfare, watching social workers humiliate her in her own home, watching her spirit crack under pressures no human should endure. Louise began to withdraw from reality. The breaking was gradual but inexorable. By 1938, when Malcolm was 13, she suffered a complete mental breakdown. She was institutionalized at the Kalamazoo State Hospital, where she would remain for 26 years. The state scattered the little children among foster homes and institutions. Malcolm, the brightest of them, the one teachers said had potential, was placed with a white family, the Gohannas. He was the only black child in an all-white school in Mason, Michigan. He was smart, popular even, elected class president. But he was also a curiosity, a pet, something exotic to be examined rather than truly seen. One conversation would change the trajectory of Malcolm's life. In the 8th grade, his English teacher, Mr. Ostrowski, asked Malcolm about his career aspirations. Malcolm, who had the highest grades in the class, said he wanted to be a lawyer. Mr. Ostrowski's response was delivered with the casual cruelty of everyday racism. Malcolm, one of life's first needs is for us to be realistic. Don't misunderstand me. Now, we all here like you know that. But you've got to be realistic about being a nigger. A lawyer, that's no realistic goal for a nigger. You need to think about something you can be. You're good with your hands. Making things. Why don't you plan on carpentry? Malcolm would later say that this moment killed something in him. Not the anger that had always been there, simmering beneath his adaptation to white spaces. No, this killed his hope. His belief that excellence could overcome racism. His faith that America would ever see him as fully human. He was 15 years old when he decided that if white America would never let him be anything but a nigger, he would be the nigger they feared most. Malcolm left Michigan and moved to Boston to live with his half-sister Ella, a strong-willed woman who ran her household with the same iron determination that had characterized Malcolm's mother. Ella saw potential in Malcolm and wanted to nurture it, to guide him toward education and opportunity. But Malcolm was done with white America's promises. In Boston's Roxbury neighborhood, he discovered a different world, a black world that operated by its own rules. Here, black men wore zoot suits and spoke their own language. Here, intelligence was measured not by white approval, but by street smarts and hustle. Here, Malcolm Little began his transformation into Detroit Red. The name came from his reddish hair, inherited from his maternal grandfather, a white man who had raped his grandmother. But it also represented his new identity, sharp, dangerous, memorable. Detroit Red was everything Malcolm Little had been taught not to be: unapologetic, flamboyant, criminally enterprising. He got a job as a shoeshine boy at the Roseland Ballroom, but that was just the front. What he really learned was the ecosystem of the street, who ran numbers, who sold drugs, who controlled what territories, who could be trusted and who would sell you out for a nickel. He learned to conk his hair, pressing hot lye into his scalp to straighten his natural texture, a painful process he would later describe as his first step toward self-hatred, physically burning himself to look more acceptable to white standards. When Malcolm moved to Harlem in 1943, he entered the epicenter of black culture and black crime. Harlem during World War II was a pressure cooker of creativity and desperation. The Savoy Ballroom, the Apollo Theater, Small's Paradise, these were the stages where black excellence performed for itself. But behind the glamour was a grinding poverty, a police force that saw every black man as a criminal, and an economy built on hustles, both legal and illegal. Malcolm sold drugs. He ran numbers. He steered white customers to black prostitutes. He coordinated burglaries. He carried a gun and cultivated a reputation for being just crazy enough that people thought twice before crossing him. This was survival masquerading as success, desperation dressed up as confidence. But even in his deepest degradation, Malcolm was learning. He watched how power operated in the street, who had it, who wanted it, how it was taken and maintained. He saw how racism created an underground economy where black people turned on each other for scraps. He witnessed how drugs and alcohol kept people pacified, too anesthetized to fight their real enemies. These lessons would resurface later, transformed by consciousness into political analysis. He also experienced his first serious relationship during this period, with a white woman named Bea. Their relationship was transgressive in 1940s America, dangerous even. But it was also complicated by Malcolm's growing rage and self-destruction. He would later acknowledge that he used that relationship partly as rebellion, partly as self-medication, and partly as a way to wound the white establishment that had wounded him. By 1946, Malcolm's hustling had caught up with him. He organized a burglary ring that targeted wealthy homes in Boston, a ring that included his white girlfriend and her sister. When they were finally caught, the sentencing revealed everything about American justice. Malcolm and his black accomplice received 10-year sentences, while the white women received much lighter sentences. The subtext was clear. These black men had corrupted innocent white women, and they would pay dearly for it. Malcolm Little entered Charlestown State Prison in February 1946. He was 20 years old, angry, addicted, barely literate despite his intelligence. He cursed so much the other inmates called him Satan. He was on a fast track to nowhere, another black man destroyed by a system designed to destroy black men. But prison, paradoxically, would save him. Because in that cage, Malcolm would meet the ideas that would break his mental chains. Malcolm's transformation began with a letter from his brother Filbert, who had joined something called the Nation of Islam. The letter urged Malcolm to stop eating pork, stop smoking, and prepare himself for the natural religion of the black man. Malcolm's first response was mockery. But his brother persisted, and soon other siblings, Reginald, Hilda, Wilfred, were writing with the same message. Then Reginald visited and told Malcolm something that stopped him cold. The white man is the devil. For most people, this statement would seem like extremist rhetoric. But for Malcolm, sitting in a cell, reviewing his entire life through this lens, it was a revelation that made terrible sense. The white people who had killed his father, devils. The welfare workers who broke his mother, Devils. The teacher who crushed his dreams? Devils. The system that gave him 10 years for burglary, while white men walked free after killing black men? Devils. It was crude theology, perhaps. But for a man who had internalized his own worthlessness, who had spent years destroying himself because that's what society expected, this simple formulation offered something radical. It wasn't his fault. The problem wasn't him, it was them. Malcolm threw himself into self-education with the same intensity he had brought to hustling. He began copying the entire dictionary, word by word, to improve his vocabulary and handwriting. He read everything in the prison library: philosophy, history, science, religion. He studied particularly the history of slavery, colonialism, and racism, reading works by Will Durant, H. G. Wells, and Carter G. Woodson. But more than anything, he studied the teachings of Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Nation of Islam. Muhammad taught that black people were the original people, that white people were created by an evil scientist named Yaqub, that black Americans were lost tribe members who needed to wake up to their true identity and separate from white society. These teachings were a mixture of Islam, black nationalism, and mythology. Mainstream Muslims rejected them. Scholars disputed them. But for Malcolm, they provided a framework that transformed his understanding of himself and his place in the world. He began to pray. He stopped eating pork, stopped smoking, stopped cursing. He started debating other inmates, refining his arguments, learning to marshal facts and logic in service of this new ideology. He discovered he had a gift for speaking, for persuading, for breaking down complex ideas into powerful, accessible language. When Malcolm was transferred to Norfolk Prison Colony, a more progressive facility with a better library, his education accelerated. He joined the prison debate team and discovered he could out-argue college students who visited. He continued his correspondence with Elijah Muhammad, who responded personally, calling Malcolm his spiritual son. In 1952, after serving 7 years, Malcolm was released on parole. He was 27 years old. He had entered prison as Detroit Red, a hustler with no future. He left as Malcolm X, the X representing his stolen African name, replacing the slave name little given to his ancestors by their white owners. The transformation was total. The man who had combed his hair now wore it naturally. The man who had worshipped white culture now rejected everything white. The man who had destroyed himself with drugs and crime now lived with monastic discipline. It was as if Malcolm Little and Detroit Red had both died in that cell, and someone entirely new had been born. But this was not the final Malcolm. This was only the second act. The man who left prison was certain, righteous, and uncompromising. He knew the truth, and the truth was simple. White was evil, black was good, and separation was the only answer. Life, however, had more lessons to teach him, and the greatest teacher would be a woman named Betty Sanders. Malcolm X didn't just join the Nation of Islam. He became its most effective recruiter and its most powerful voice. Elijah Muhammad recognized Malcolm's gifts and appointed him minister of Temple No. 7 in Harlem, the most important temple outside of Chicago. Malcolm transformed Temple No. 7 from a small storefront operation into a powerhouse. His street credibility gave him access to the people mainstream civil rights organizations couldn't reach: the hustlers, the prisoners, the unemployed, the angry young men who saw no future in white America. His intelligence allowed him to articulate the rage that poor black people felt but couldn't express. His discipline proved that transformation was possible. Within a few years, Malcolm had increased the nation's membership exponentially. He established new temples across the country. He started the nation's newspaper, Muhammad Speaks. He became the face and voice of black rage in America, the man white America feared and black America couldn't ignore. But there was something missing in Malcolm's life. For all his power and purpose, he was alone. The discipline that had saved him also isolated him. He lived in a tiny apartment with minimal possessions. He worked constantly. He had no personal life, no intimate relationships, no softness to balance the hardness of his public persona. Betty Sanders was a student at the Tuskegee Institute when she first heard Malcolm speak at a Nation of Islam meeting in 1956. She was immediately struck by his intelligence and conviction, but she was also put off by what seemed like misogyny in the nation's teachings, the idea that women should be submissive, that their primary role was to support men and raise children. Betty was an independent woman, often young, educated, with her own ambitions. She had survived childhood trauma and foster care. She had put herself through nursing school. She was not looking for a man to complete her. She was already complete. But Malcolm intrigued her. Beneath the fierce rhetoric, she sensed something deeper, an intelligence that wrestled with complex questions, a pain that mirrored her own, a loneliness that he masked with constant work. They began talking after meetings. Malcolm, who could command audiences of thousands, found himself surprisingly nervous around this poised, articulate woman. She challenged him, questioned his ideas, made him defend positions he had taken for granted. She saw through the public persona to the man beneath, still healing, still growing, still figuring things out. Their courtship, if it could be called that, was unlike anything Malcolm had experienced. It was intellectual and spiritual rather than physical. They talked about books, about Black history, about the future they wanted to build. Malcolm found in Betty something he hadn't realized he needed, a partner who could match his intelligence, challenge his assumptions, and see his humanity beyond his public image. Malcolm proposed to Betty in late 1957, and they married on January 14, 1958. It was not a romantic proposal by conventional standards. Malcolm was practical to a fault. But Betty understood that for Malcolm, the decision to marry was profound. He was choosing to let someone into his life, to be vulnerable, to build something that wasn't just about the movement. Their marriage would become the foundation that allowed Malcolm to do his most important work. Betty understood the demands of his mission and supported them, even when it meant long absences, constant danger, and very little money. She managed their household, raised their daughters, they would eventually have 6, and created a sanctuary where Malcolm could be simply a man, not a symbol. But Betty was not merely supportive. She was a force in her own right. She continued her education, earning advanced degrees. She had her own opinions about the movement and wasn't shy about expressing them. She humanized Malcolm, softened some of his harder edges, reminded him that revolution had to be about building something, not just destroying. Their home life was disciplined but warm. Malcolm was strict with his daughters but adored them. He changed diapers, helped with homework, played with them when he was home. Betty managed the chaos of raising children, while her husband became one of the most famous men in America. In Betty, Malcolm found what his political philosophy had told him to reject, a partnership based on mutual respect, intellectual equality, and genuine love. She would later say that Malcolm was different at home than in public. At home, he laughed, he relaxed, he admitted his doubts and fears. At home, he was not Malcolm X, the firebrand minister. He was her husband, the father of her children, a man trying to figure out how to change the world while protecting the people he loved. This grounding would become essential as Malcolm's relationship with the Nation of Islam began to fracture, and as his understanding of the world began to expand beyond the rigid categories he had once embraced. By 1959, Malcolm X was no longer just a minister in a fringe religious group. He was a national figure. Mike Wallace's documentary The Hate That Hate Produced introduced mainstream white America to Malcolm and the Nation of Islam, portraying them as dangerous extremists preaching racial hatred. The documentary was sensationalistic and one-sided, but it made Malcolm famous. Suddenly, he was on television, debating civil rights leaders and white intellectuals. He was quoted in newspapers, profiled in magazines, and invited to speak at universities. He became the counterpoint to Martin Luther King Jr.'s nonviolent approach, the angry to King's hopeful, the militant to King's moderate. But this fame created tension within the Nation of Islam. Elijah Muhammad had positioned himself as the sole voice of authority, the messenger of Allah. Malcolm's growing prominence threatened that structure. Other ministers became jealous. Rumors circulated that Malcolm was trying to take over. Muhammad himself began to show signs of resentment, making subtle comments about Malcolm's ambition. Malcolm, for his part, insisted that he was only trying to serve the nation and spread its message. He directed all credit to Elijah Muhammad, referring to him constantly as the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and positioning himself as merely a minister following his leader's teachings. But the seeds of conflict had been planted. In late 1962 and early 1963, Malcolm began hearing disturbing rumors about Elijah Muhammad. Multiple women who had worked as secretaries in the nation's headquarters alleged that Muhammad had fathered children with them outside of his marriage. These allegations directly contradicted the nation's strict moral code, which condemned adultery and preached sexual discipline. At first, Malcolm refused to believe it. Elijah Muhammad had been his savior, his spiritual father, the man who had given him purpose and direction when he had none. The idea that this moral exemplar could be guilty of such hypocrisy was almost unbearable. But the evidence accumulated. Malcolm met with some of the women. He saw the children who bore obvious resemblance to Muhammad. He confronted Muhammad directly, hoping for an explanation that would make sense of it all. Muhammad's response was to compare himself to biblical figures like Noah and David, who had also committed sins but remained prophets. He told Malcolm that his indiscretions were part of fulfilling prophecy. The explanation was weak, and Malcolm knew it. But what could he do? Leave the organization that had saved his life? Betray the man who had given him everything? Malcolm confided in Betty, who had her own complicated relationship with the nation's leadership. She supported Malcolm, but also worried about what would happen if he challenged Muhammad. They had 6 daughters to think about, a life built within the nation's structure. Leaving would mean losing everything: their community, their income, their identity. On November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. The Nation of Islam had a strict policy: do not comment on the assassination. It was too controversial, too likely to bring negative attention. But when Malcolm was asked about it during a public event, he couldn't resist. He said that Kennedy's assassination was a case of chickens coming home to roost, that the violence America had inflicted on others, particularly on black people, had finally circled back to claim a white victim. The comment created a firestorm. The media seized on it as evidence of Malcolm's extremism. White America was outraged. Even many black Americans who had respected Malcolm thought he had gone too far. Elijah Muhammad, seeing an opportunity, publicly silenced Malcolm. He banned him from speaking for 90 days, claiming it was punishment for the comment. But Malcolm understood the subtext. This was about control, about reminding Malcolm who was in charge, about punishing him for his growing independence and his knowledge of Muhammad's indiscretions. The silencing was supposed to last 90 days. Malcolm suspected it would be permanent. He was right. In March 1964, after months of tension and increasingly clear signs that he was being pushed out, Malcolm X announced he was leaving the Nation of Islam. The statement was carefully worded. He expressed continued respect for Elijah Muhammad while asserting his need to be more politically active than the nation's apolitical stance allowed. But privately, the break was devastating. Malcolm was leaving the only family he had known since prison, the structure that had given his life meaning for 12 years. He was leaving with no organization, no income, no clear path forward. He was starting over at 38 years old, with a wife and daughters depending on him, and with the nation's considerable power now turned against him. Betty stood by him, but even she must have wondered what came next. Malcolm founded 2 new organizations: Muslim Mosque Incorporated, a religious organization, and the Organization of Afro-American Unity, a secular group focused on human rights. But these were embryonic, unfunded, uncertain ventures. What Malcolm needed was perspective, space to think, a way to understand what he truly believed now that he was free from the nation's rigid ideology. And so, in April 1964, he did something that would fundamentally transform his understanding of race, religion, and revolution. He went to Mecca. The pilgrimage to Mecca is one of the 5 pillars of Islam, an obligation for every Muslim who can afford it. Malcolm had been teaching Islam for years, but the Nation of Islam's version was so heterodox that mainstream Muslims didn't recognize it. Now, free from those constraints, Malcolm was ready to experience Orthodox Islam. What he encountered in Mecca shattered many of his fundamental assumptions. For the first time in his life, Malcolm saw people of all races, white, black, brown, Asian, praying together, eating together, treating each other as true equals. He saw white-skinned Muslims from Turkey and Bosnia and recognized them as his brothers in faith, not as devils. In a famous letter to Betty and his supporters back home, Malcolm wrote, "Never have I witnessed such sincere hospitality and overwhelming spirit of true brotherhood as is practiced by people of all colors and races here in this ancient holy land. For the past week, I have been utterly speechless and spellbound by the graciousness I see displayed all around me by people of all colors. He continued, America needs to understand Islam, because this is the one religion that erases from its society the race problem. Throughout my travels in the Muslim world, I have met, talked to, and even eaten with people who in America would have been considered white, but the white attitude was removed from their minds by the religion of Islam. Malcolm returned from Mecca as El-Hajj Malik el-Shabazz, his new Muslim name. But more importantly, he returned with a transformed worldview. He now understood that the problem wasn't white skin, it was white supremacy, a system that could be challenged and changed. He realized that allies could come from any race, that the struggle was about justice, not separation. This evolution confused some of his supporters and relieved some of his critics. Was Malcolm going soft? Had he abandoned his militancy? The answer was more complex. Malcolm hadn't abandoned his rage at injustice or his commitment to black liberation. But he had expanded his understanding of how that liberation could be achieved. He began building bridges with civil rights leaders he had previously criticized. He met with Martin Luther King Jr. briefly, and while they remained philosophically different, there was a new respect between them. He spoke at universities, articulating a more nuanced vision that combined black nationalism with internationalism, that saw the black American struggle as connected to anti-colonial struggles worldwide. He softened his stance on integration, acknowledging that forced separation was no more just enforced integration, that black people should have the freedom to choose. He emphasized education, economic development, and political organization rather than just rhetoric. He talked about building institutions, not just condemning existing ones. Throughout this period of radical transformation, Betty was Malcolm's anchor. As he wrestled with his evolving beliefs, as he faced criticism from former allies and death threats from the Nation of Islam, Betty provided stability. She was pregnant with their sixth daughter during this tumultuous year. She managed their home, protected their children from the violence that was increasingly directed at their family, and supported Malcolm's work even as she must have feared for his life. Betty's influence on Malcolm during this period was profound. She encouraged the softer aspects of his transformation, the recognition that revolution had to be about building better systems, not just destroying bad ones. She reminded him that he was fighting for his daughter's future, that the world he wanted to create had to be one where they could thrive. Malcolm began to speak more about family, about the importance of fathers, about creating strong black institutions that could nurture children. These themes had always been present in his work, but they became more central. He was thinking now not just as a revolutionary, but as a father, a husband, a man who wanted to leave something lasting. By late 1964, Malcolm was living under constant death threats. The Nation of Islam, which had once been his family, now viewed him as a traitor. Louis Farrakhan, who had been Malcolm's protege, wrote in Muhammad Speaks that Malcolm was worthy of death. Other ministers made similar statements. Malcolm knew he was in danger. His car was firebombed. He received threatening phone calls. He was followed by men he recognized from the nation. The FBI, which had been monitoring him for years, noted the threats but did nothing to protect him. Some evidence suggests they may have been actively working to exacerbate tensions between Malcolm and the nation. Betty lived with this terror daily. She had to explain to her young daughters why men were watching their house, why they couldn't play outside unsupervised, why their father looked exhausted and worried. She had to be strong for her children, while her own fear must have been overwhelming. In February 1965, their house was firebombed in the middle of the night. The family barely escaped. Malcolm carried his daughters out of the burning house, their home and possessions destroyed. The nation claimed Malcolm had done it himself for publicity. Malcolm knew who was responsible, but proving it was impossible. In his last weeks, Malcolm was exhausted but determined. He was trying to build his new organizations, to articulate his evolved philosophy, to create something that would outlast him. He told Betty and close associates that he didn't think he would live long. He said, "It's a time for martyrs now, and if I am to be one, it will be for the cause of brotherhood." On February 21, 1965, Malcolm went to speak at the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem. Betty was there with their daughters. She had argued against bringing the children, but Malcolm wanted them there. Perhaps he wanted to see them one more time. Perhaps he wanted witnesses to what he believed was coming. As Malcolm began to speak, a disturbance broke out in the audience. As he called for calm, 3 men rushed forward with guns. They shot him 15 times at close range, in front of his wife and children, in front of hundreds of witnesses. Betty screamed and threw herself over her husband's body, trying to shield him, though he was already dead. The daughters witnessed their father's murder. The assassins tried to flee, but one was caught by the crowd and beaten. 2 others escaped. 3 men were eventually convicted of Malcolm's murder, all Nation of Islam members. But questions remain about who ordered the killing, whether there was a broader conspiracy, whether law enforcement agencies that had been monitoring Malcolm could have prevented it but chose not to. Malcolm X was 39 years old when he died. He had lived 3 lifetimes, as Malcolm Little, as Detroit Red, as Malcolm X, and finally, just beginning, as El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz. He died just as his thinking had evolved to its most sophisticated and hopeful point, just as he was beginning to build a movement that could truly change America. Betty Sanders X was 30 years old, pregnant, and suddenly a widow with 6 daughters to raise alone. The Nation of Islam, the organization that had been her community, was now her enemy. She had no money. Malcolm had died with almost nothing, having given everything to the movement. She had death threats to worry about. She had trauma to process. And she had to figure out how to explain to her children why their father was gone. Betty Shabazz could have crumbled under the weight of widowhood, trauma, and poverty. Instead, she became one of the strongest voices for Malcolm's true legacy. She went back to school, earning a doctorate in education. She raised her 6 daughters, all of whom would go on to successful careers. She became a professor and administrator at Medgar Evers College in Brooklyn, educating a new generation about Black history and civil rights. Betty spent the rest of her life protecting and interpreting Malcolm's legacy. She fought against simplistic portrayals that reduced him to a violent extremist. She insisted that people understand his evolution, his complexity, his final message of universal human rights rather than narrow nationalism. She also paid a terrible price. In 1997, her grandson, Malcolm's grandson, set fire to her apartment. Betty suffered burns over 80% of her body and died 3 weeks later. Even in death, the violence that had claimed Malcolm's life continued to haunt his family. But what Betty preserved, and what Malcolm's assassination paradoxically ensured, was that his ideas would outlive him. In death, Malcolm X became more influential than he had ever been in life. His autobiography, completed just before his death with Alex Haley, became a classic, introducing millions to his journey from criminal to revolutionary. The book's power lay in its honesty. Malcolm didn't hide his mistakes or pretend to have always been righteous. He showed transformation was possible, that no one was beyond redemption, that consciousness could be awakened at any point. As the 1960s progressed and the civil rights movement encountered increasing resistance, Malcolm's analysis began to seem prophetic. His critique of white liberalism, his emphasis on self-defense, his connection of Black American struggles to global anti-colonial movements, all of this resonated with a generation that was growing impatient with the pace of change. The Black Power movement that emerged in the late 1960s drew heavily on Malcolm's ideas, even as they sometimes simplified or distorted them. Young activists wore buttons with his image, quoted his speeches, invoked his name. Malcolm X became a symbol of uncompromising resistance, of refusing to beg for rights that should be inherent, of meeting violence with strength rather than turning the other cheek. Malcolm's life offers profound lessons that extend far beyond politics and race. At its core, his story is about the possibility of transformation, about the courage it takes to change your mind, to admit you were wrong, to grow beyond the person you once were. Malcolm transformed not once but multiple times. From Malcolm Little to Detroit Red, a descent into self-destruction. From Detroit Red to Malcolm X, a resurrection through rigid ideology. From Malcolm X to El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, an evolution toward nuance and complexity. Each transformation required courage. It's hard to change. It's harder still to change publicly, to admit that the things you once said with such certainty might have been wrong or incomplete. Malcolm did this repeatedly. He never stopped learning, never stopped questioning, never stopped growing. In our current moment, when people are often judged by their worst statements, when cancel culture makes evolution difficult, When admitting error is seen as weakness, Malcolm's journey offers a different model. That growth is not betrayal, that complexity is not inconsistency, that changing your mind is a sign of intelligence, not weakness. Malcolm's relationship with Betty also offers lessons, particularly for those interested in marriage and partnership. Their relationship was not perfect. Malcolm was often absent. His work consumed him. The danger he brought into their lives was enormous. But it was also deeply committed, mutually respectful, and genuinely loving. Betty didn't just support Malcolm. She challenged him, grounded him, humanized him. She saw beyond the public figure to the man beneath. And Malcolm, for all his stern public persona, was tender with his wife and daughters. He understood that revolution had to include the domestic, that you couldn't fight for justice in the world while creating injustice in your home. Their partnership reminds us that strong relationships require seeing each other fully, not as projections or symbols, but as complex human beings. Betty loved Malcolm, knowing all his flaws and his past. Malcolm loved Betty for her strength and independence, not despite them. In a marriage and relationship context, their story teaches us about standing by our partners through transformation, about supporting each other's growth even when it's uncomfortable, about creating homes that can be both sanctuaries and launching pads for changing the world. More than 5 decades after his death, Malcolm X remains relevant. His image adorns t-shirts and murals. His quotes circulate on social media. His autobiography is still assigned in high schools and universities. But beyond the iconography, his ideas continue to speak to contemporary struggles. Malcolm's analysis of systemic racism, of how oppression operates through institutions rather than just individual prejudice, has become foundational to contemporary discourse about structural inequality. His emphasis on self-determination, on communities controlling their own institutions and economies, resonates with current movements for economic justice. His evolution on the question of allies and coalition building speaks to ongoing debates about solidarity, about who can participate in movements for justice, about how to build power without compromising principles. His internationalism, his insistence that Black American struggles were connected to struggles against colonialism and imperialism worldwide, prefigures today's global justice movements. Most powerfully, Malcolm's journey from self-hatred to self-love, from internalized racism to Black pride, continues to inspire people grappling with identity in a world that still devalues Blackness. His transformation shows that liberation is both political and personal, that changing systems requires first changing how we see ourselves. The comparison between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. has become almost reflexive in discussions of civil rights history. They are positioned as opposites, Malcolm the militant, Martin the moderate. Malcolm advocating violence, Martin preaching nonviolence, Malcolm separatist, Martin integrationist. But this binary is too simple and ultimately misleading. Both men were more complex than their stereotypes suggest. Martin King moved leftward over time, becoming more radical in his critique of capitalism and militarism. Malcolm moved toward acknowledging the potential for coalitions across racial lines. By the end of their lives, they were closer philosophically than they had been at the beginning. Moreover, their approaches were not contradictory but complementary. Malcolm's militancy made Martin's moderation more palatable to white America, the good Negro versus the bad Negro, a dynamic Malcolm understood and sometimes consciously exploited. At the same time, Martin's moral appeals created space for political organizing that Malcolm could build upon. What both men shared was an absolute commitment to Black liberation, a willingness to sacrifice personal safety for the cause, and an evolution in their thinking that showed intellectual honesty and courage. The tragedy is not that they disagreed. Healthy movements need debate and diversity of tactics, but that both were assassinated before they could fully develop their mature philosophies and potentially work together. When Malcolm X died at 39, we lost not just who he was, but who he was becoming. The Malcolm of early 1965 was a most intellectually sophisticated, politically nuanced, and strategically thoughtful version of himself. He had moved beyond simple answers, beyond rigid ideologies, toward a vision that could truly challenge American racism, while building genuine international solidarity. Will lost the book he was planning to write about his journey to Mecca in Africa, which would have offered his most mature thinking on race, religion, and revolution. We lost the organization he was building, which might have created a political vehicle for black empowerment that avoided the pitfalls of both the Nation of Islam's insularity and mainstream civil rights organizations' compromises. We lost the potential reconciliation with Martin Luther King Jr. that both men seemed to be moving toward. We lost Malcolm as a father who could have continued modeling for his daughters what strong, principled, evolving black manhood looked like. We lost Malcolm as a husband who could have built a long life with Betty, supporting her own growth and aspirations. We lost Malcolm as an elder statesman who could have guided subsequent generations through the challenges that would come, the backlash against civil rights gains, the war on drugs that would devastate black communities, the rise of mass incarceration, the persistent economic inequality. His voice, had it survived to speak to these issues, might have provided direction that was sorely missed. But perhaps what we lost most was the example of continued evolution. Malcolm at 39 was dramatically different from Malcolm at 29, who was unrecognizable from Malcolm at 19. If he had lived to 49, to 59, to 69, how much further would his thinking have developed? What new insights would he have gained? What errors might he have corrected? We live in an age that demands ideological purity, that punishes people for past mistakes, that treats change as betrayal. Malcolm's continued evolution would have demonstrated that growth is not only possible but necessary, that the most revolutionary act might be the willingness to admit you were wrong and chart a new course. His journey from the rigid certainties of the Nation of Islam to the more complex understanding he was developing at the end of his life shows that truth is not found once and for all, but discovered gradually, through experience, reflection, and the courage to question what you once believed absolutely. While Malcolm X is primarily remembered as a political figure, his life offers profound insights for anyone thinking about relationships, marriage, and personal transformation. His story demonstrates that the most intimate relationships can be catalysts for revolutionary change, and that personal growth and political consciousness are inseparable. Malcolm's relationship with Betty was not incidental to his evolution, it was central to it. Betty provided the emotional safety that allowed Malcolm to question, to doubt, to grow. She created a home where the fierce public warrior could be vulnerable, uncertain, human. In that vulnerability, transformation became possible. This teaches us something essential about healthy relationships. They should be spaces where we can evolve, where we can try on new ideas, where we can admit we were wrong without fear of judgment or abandonment. Betty didn't require Malcolm to remain the rigid, certain man she married. She loved him through his changes, even when those changes created uncertainty and danger for their family. Malcolm and Betty's marriage was built on genuine partnership. Despite the patriarchal structures of both the Nation of Islam and 1960s America generally, their relationship was characterized by mutual respect and intellectual equality. Betty was educated, opinionated, and strong-willed. Malcolm didn't ask her to diminish herself to make him feel larger. He respected her intelligence, consulted her on important decisions, and acknowledged her influence on his thinking. When he traveled to Mecca and Africa, he wrote to Betty not just with personal news, but with his evolving ideas, treating her as an intellectual partner. This stands in stark contrast to stereotypes about Malcolm as a misogynist or about Muslim marriages as necessarily oppressive. The reality was more complex. While Malcolm came from a tradition that emphasized distinct gender roles, his actual marriage was characterized by flexibility, respect, and genuine partnership. For modern couples, this offers an important lesson. You can honor tradition while also adapting it to create relationships that work for both partners. Masculinity doesn't require domination. Femininity doesn't require submission. Strong relationships are built on recognizing and valuing what each person brings. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Malcolm and Betty's relationship was Betty's willingness to stay with Malcolm despite the very real danger his work brought to their family. She knew he was at risk. She knew that risk extended to her and their daughters. She had every reason to ask him to choose between his mission and his family. But Betty understood something profound, that Malcolm's work was not separate from his love for his family but an expression of it. He was fighting to create a world where his daughters could live with dignity, where black children could grow up without the trauma of racism, where justice was not just a dream but a reality. Betty's support wasn't passive acceptance. She expressed her fears. She argued with him when she thought he was taking unnecessary risks. She made clear what his death would cost. But ultimately, she honored his right to choose his path, even when that path led toward martyrdom. This raises difficult questions for any couple where one partner's calling involves risk or sacrifice. How do you balance personal safety with moral imperatives? How do you support a partner's mission when that mission might take them from you? How do you love someone while also accepting that they may choose principles over preservation? There are no easy answers. But Malcolm and Betty's relationship shows that it's possible to love fully while also respecting each other's autonomy, to create family while also working for justice, to build a home while also fighting to transform the world. Malcolm's relationship with his daughters reveals another dimension of his character often overlooked in political analyses. He was, by all accounts, a devoted and engaged father. He changed diapers, helped with homework, played games, told stories, showed affection. This wasn't just about being a good dad, though it was that. It was also about modeling a different kind of black manhood. Malcolm had grown up witnessing his own father's strength, but also his absence after death. He had seen how racism destroyed black families, how it prevented black men from protecting and providing for their children. By being present for his daughters, by showing them love and attention, by creating a stable home despite the chaos of his public life, Malcolm was enacting a form of resistance. He was proving that black fathers could be nurturing, that black families could be strong, that racism's attempt to destroy black family structures could be overcome through intentional effort. For modern fathers, particularly black fathers navigating a society that still stereotypes them as absent or irresponsible, Malcolm's example is powerful. Fatherhood is revolutionary work. Being present, being loving, being engaged, these are not just personal acts but political ones. After Malcolm's death, Betty Shabazz faced the enormous challenge of raising 6 daughters alone while also preserving her husband's legacy. She did both with remarkable strength and grace. Betty went back to school, earning her doctorate in education. She became a professor and administrator, creating financial stability for her family while also contributing to her community. She raised her daughters to be strong, educated, independent women. All 6 earned college degrees, and several earned advanced degrees. Atala, the eldest, became an actress and author. Kubala became a lawyer. Ilyasa became an author and speaker. Gamila became a designer. The twins, Malak and Malika, pursued education and activism. But the family also experienced ongoing trauma. Kubala was accused in a case many believe was a setup of plotting to kill Louis Farrakhan, whom the family blamed for Malcolm's death. Malcolm's grandson, Kubala's son, struggled with mental illness, and in 1997 set the fire that killed Betty. The family struggles remind us that trauma ripples through generations, that violence has consequences that extend far beyond the immediate victim, that healing is a long and sometimes incomplete process. In her final years, Betty Shabazz did something remarkable. She reconciled with Louis Farrakhan. In 1995, 30 years after Malcolm's assassination, Kubala was arrested in the alleged plot against Farrakhan. Betty, desperate to protect her daughter, reached out to Farrakhan for help. What followed was a gradual thawing of decades of enmity. Farrakhan publicly acknowledged that the Nation of Islam bore responsibility for creating the climate that led to Malcolm's death, though he continued to deny direct involvement. Betty accepted this partial acknowledgement and worked with Farrakhan to have the charges against Kubala reduced. This reconciliation was controversial. Many of Malcolm's supporters felt Betty had betrayed his memory by forgiving the organization they believed had murdered him. But Betty's choice reflected a deeper wisdom, that holding on to hatred was poisoning her and her family, that healing required letting go, that justice and vengeance are not the same thing. It was an act of extraordinary courage and grace, one that Malcolm himself might have understood. After all, his own journey had been about transcending hatred, about recognizing common humanity even in enemies, about choosing the difficult path of growth over the easier path of rigid certainty. In the final analysis, Malcolm and Betty's marriage was not just a personal relationship, but a historical force. Betty's support enabled Malcolm to do his most important work. Her grounding allowed him to take the risks that ultimately cost his life. Her strength after his death ensured that his legacy would be preserved and transmitted to future generations. Their relationship demonstrates that behind every public figure is a private support system, that great movements are built not just by charismatic leaders but by the families who sustain them, that the personal is indeed political. For anyone thinking about relationships and marriage, Malcolm and Betty's story offers this lesson. The best partnerships make both people more than they could be alone. Betty didn't diminish Malcolm, she amplified him. Malcolm didn't constrain Betty, he supported her growth. Together, they created something larger than themselves, not just 6 daughters, but a legacy that continues to inspire and challenge us. As we look at Malcolm X from the distance of more than half a century, it's tempting to simplify him, to make him either a saint or villain, a hero or a hate-monger, an inspiration or cautionary tale. But Malcolm resists simplification. He was all of those things at different times, and sometimes several of them simultaneously. He was a criminal who became a minister who became a revolutionary who evolved towards something more nuanced and humane. He preached hatred and then transcended it. He made mistakes and acknowledged them. He held rigid beliefs and then had the courage to change them. In our current moment, when public figures are often reduced to their worst statements, when past errors are treated as unforgivable sins, when growth is dismissed as opportunism, we need Malcolm's example of constant evolution. We need to remember that people are not static, that consciousness can be raised, that no one is beyond redemption. Malcolm's life and death leave us with profound questions that remain urgent today. How do we balance militancy and strategy? Malcolm understood that righteous anger was justified and necessary, but he also came to see that anger alone could not build institutions or create lasting change. How do we honor the rage that oppression produces, while also channeling it toward effective action? How do we build coalitions without compromising principles? Malcolm's evolution toward accepting allies across racial lines didn't mean abandoning his commitment to black liberation. How do we create solidarity movements that center the most oppressed while also welcoming support from those with privilege? How do we tell the truth about America without giving up on the possibility of change? Malcolm was unflinching in his critique of American racism, calling it what it was without euphemism or apology. But he also came to believe that transformation was possible. How do we maintain both critical consciousness and hope? How do we honor our ancestors while also adapting to new circumstances? Malcolm respected tradition, but wasn't enslaved by it. He could honor Elijah Muhammad's role in saving his life while also moving beyond Muhammad's limited vision. How do we learn from the past without being trapped by it? But perhaps Malcolm's most important lesson is about the relationship between personal transformation and political change. Malcolm's political evolution was inseparable from his personal growth. His willingness to change his mind about race relations was connected to his deepening relationship with Betty, to his experience as a father, to his spiritual journey. This reminds us that we cannot separate our political commitments from our personal lives. How we treat our partners, how we raise our children, how we navigate our own growth, these are not separate from the work of building a more just world. They are the foundation of that work. Malcolm understood, especially toward the end of his life, that revolution is not just about overthrowing external systems. It's also about transforming our internal landscape, confronting our own prejudices, healing our own wounds, developing our own capacity for love and compassion while maintaining our commitment to justice. If Malcolm X could speak to us today, what would he say? We can only speculate, but based on the trajectory of his thinking, we might imagine. He would call out the persistent racism that continues to structure American society, the racial wealth gap, mass incarceration, police violence, educational inequality. He would not mince words or seek to make white America comfortable. But he would also challenge Black Americans to take responsibility for building our own institutions, for educating our children, for creating economic power, for organizing politically. He would insist that waiting for white America to grant justice is a fool's errand. We must seize it ourselves. He would criticize superficial diversity that changes faces but not systems. He would ask hard questions about representation without power, about Black faces in high places who don't challenge structural racism. He would connect Black American struggles to global struggles against injustice, to Palestinians, to indigenous peoples, to the poor everywhere. He would insist that racism, capitalism, and militarism are linked systems that must be challenged together. He would call for education, 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 not just formal schooling, but self-education, historical consciousness, political awareness. He would insist that we cannot fight what we don't understand. But he would also, based on his final evolution, emphasize building over destroying, creating alternatives over just critiquing what exists, coalition over isolation. He would challenge us to be as strategic as we are righteous, as practical as we are principled. In the end, Malcolm X's life offers one overarching lesson: transformation is always possible. No matter how far you have fallen, no matter how lost you are, no matter how certain you are that you have found final truth, you can still change. You can still grow. You can still become something more than you are. Malcolm Little became Detroit Red, became Malcolm X, became El Hajj Malik El Shabazz. And if he had lived, he would have continued evolving, continued learning, continued growing. That's not weakness, that's strength. That's not inconsistency, that's integrity. That's not betrayal, that's courage. For those struggling in relationships, Malcolm and Betty's story shows that love can survive transformation, that partnerships can accommodate growth, that we can change ourselves without losing connection to those who love us. For those fighting for justice, Malcolm's evolution shows that we can maintain our commitment to liberation while also refining our understanding of how to achieve it, that changing tactics is not the same as changing goals, that wisdom comes from experience and reflection. For those wrestling with identity, Malcolm's journey from self-hatred to self-love, from internalized racism to black pride, shows that healing is possible, that we can overcome the psychological damage of oppression, that consciousness can be raised. Malcolm X was assassinated on February 21, 1965, at the age of 39. He died too young, with too much still to say and do. But what he left behind, in his words, in his example, in his evolution, continues to challenge and inspire us. He taught us that we are not bound by our past, that redemption is possible, that transformation is the most revolutionary act. He taught us that love and militancy are not opposites, that you can be fierce in your commitment to justice, while also being tender with those you love. He taught us that truth is not static, that growth requires courage, that admitting you were wrong is a sign of strength, not weakness. His relationship with Betty Shabazz taught us that behind every public struggle is a private one, that great movements are sustained by strong families, that partnership means supporting each other's evolution even when it's scary or uncertain. His assassination taught us that speaking truth to power is dangerous, that the forces of oppression will strike down those who threaten them most effectively, that martyrdom is sometimes the price of conviction. But his resurrection in the decades since his death teaches us something more hopeful, that ideas cannot be killed, that truth has power, that those who die for justice live on in the work of those who continue the struggle. Malcolm X once said, "If you're not ready to die for it, put the word freedom out of your vocabulary." He was ready. He died for it. And in dying, he ensured that the cause of freedom, of justice, of human dignity would be carried forward by millions who found inspiration in his words and his example. We are those millions. We are Malcolm's legacy. And the question he leaves us with is this: what are we ready to die for? What are we ready to live for? What are we ready to transform ourselves for? The answer to those questions will determine whether Malcolm's sacrifice was in vain or whether it was the seed from which a more just world will grow. By any means necessary. Not just freedom, not just justice, but transformation, personal and political, internal and external, individual and collective. That was Malcolm's final message. That is his gift to us. That is the challenge he leaves behind. I'm for truth, no matter who tells it. I'm for justice, no matter who it's for or against. Malcolm X.